Lovely. Well, welcome back, everybody. How's everyone doing this morning? More than I thought I was going to get. It's nice to see everybody. We have got a few more exciting things left on the schedule before we finish today. Before we do that, I'll just remind you what's coming up so you know what to expect from the morning into the afternoon. So we've got our keynote session now, which is until 11:30. We've got a coffee break then, and then we'll have our closing worship and communion at midday. Lunch will be at 1, and then we need to be gone by 2. If you do need a lift to the station earlier than that, then in the coffee break, if that's not too late, go and grab either Jen or maybe Russell. Those guys are going to be doing runs.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
I'm not doing
Okay. So we'll head for lunch a little bit early. Brilliant. Well, all I've got left to do then is introduce our keynote speaker for this afternoon. Simon Cross is a writer, journalist, avid University Challenge watcher, a URC ordinand, and chair of the Progressive Christianity Network. His talk is going to be called Bringing Radical Back. And we've got that live in here and also live on the stream for those of you watching at home as well. So in usual fashion, before Simon comes, I'll introduce him through the manner of 3 of my favourite tweets that he's done. So this first one is in response to a tweet saying, Midnight Mass is much better than Squid Game, to which he says, huge if true. This one from very, very recently saying, I'm delighted to say that I've passed my PhD Viva today with minor amends. A part-time PhD is a long journey and I'm glad to have reached the end. It's a bold engagement of complex social science and speculative philosophical theology. Good times. So, and to finish off, I was already having a decent day. Then when I cracked the first egg to make my lunchtime omelette, it was a double yolk. Joy unbounded. Simon.
They're probably the only 3 tweets I've done. I don't think I've done many more than that. Really nice to be with you. And so I don't really have much else to say about myself. But I'm at a slight disadvantage because you know a bit about me, but I don't really know very much about you guys. So just want to get a little bit of a feel of who's in the room. So how many of you are actually students? Most people is good. That's good. And whereabouts? Can you shout out some locations? I know where you are. Where else are people based? Birmingham. Oxford.
Newcastle.
Great. Who's in Cambridge? Okay, great. Southampton. Edinburgh. Where are you?
Brighton.
Brighton. Okay. Furthest one away is Brighton, I suppose. Is it? Nobody's. Oh, Edinburgh. Maybe it's further. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Good. And I've got so many questions really about you guys, and what I'm not really a big one for speeches and preachers. That's not really my kind of thing. So this morning is hopefully going to be quite discursive. I'd like to hear from you as much as you hear from me, if not a bit more, because there's more of you than there is of me. I also want to know kind of what you've already talked about so far this weekend. So I know that you've been talking about radical, but I'm not clear what you think radical is or what it might mean to you. I know also that Naomi tells me that you're progressive people. I would think of myself as progressive as well, but I don't know whether we share a meaning of that term. So I'd be interested in hearing what progressive means to you as well as radical. So can we start with radical, because you've been thinking about that all weekend? What does radical mean to you? Can you give me an idea?
Countercultural.
Countercultural. Nice. Any offers other than countercultural?
Uncompromising.
Uncompromising. Interesting. Any other thoughts? Do we know where the root of the word radical comes from?
The roots of, well, going to the roots of injustice.
So yeah, so radical from the word radix, root, okay, like a radish, when you pull up a radish, it's basically a root vegetable. The radical means going to the roots, right? So what we've been talking about over the weekend, going to the roots of things, and so that does mean to do with going against cultural flows, may well be about uncompromising, but ultimately it's about going down to the roots. So when people talk about themselves as radicals, radical Islamists or radical Christians or whatever it may be, they're talking about trying to find a root, the root of things. So I want to talk a bit about that this morning. I had a minor issue with the title of my talk, which was that when Ruth said to me, what's your talk going to be called? I said, well, you know, like bringing sexy back, we cross out the sexy and put radical instead. And she was like, oh yeah, that's fine, we'll do that. I sort of waited about 4 months, and then I got this poster thing through on my email, and it says, bringing sexy radical back with Simon Cross. I was like, I don't think I'm that guy. That's not really me. And I checked with my family, and I was right, it's not me. So bringing sexy radical back is not my thing. So apologies if you were missold a talk, but that's not what it is. What about progressive then? So what does progressive mean to you?
Moving forward, literally.
Yeah. So what's a progressive Christian? How does that differ from a normal and non-progressive Christian, do you think?
I mean, generally it means that the LGBTQ people aren't equal, so there's a burning hell.
So LGBTQ affirming, etc.
Yeah, just think a bit more about disability.
Uh-huh.
I mean, I think a lot about disability.
I wonder why. Yeah.
Introspective.
Introspective. So looking at oneself. Mm-hmm.
Always thinking about how to improve.
Mm-hmm.
Considering where we are now and how we might need to retain things, how we might need to change things.
Interesting. Good. Yeah. Any other thoughts?
Open-minded.
Nice. Yeah. Is that easy? Open-mindedness.
Always.
No. Try to keep an open mind about it. Yeah. Any other thoughts? What progressive means?
I believe that our faith calls us kind of to work for widening people's rights in general. And also the idea, like with love, not trying to have a broad view of love, I suppose. Trying to other Christians would say they include everyone, so it's not a good way of phrasing it, but really including everyone.
It's a tricky word, isn't it? It's a tricky word. So I'm the chair of Progressive Christianity Network. We've got a load of stuff over there. Feel free to take as much as you like. There's free memberships as well. It says free student memberships, I see. But as far as I'm concerned, it's free SCM memberships for the rest of the year. So do join up and see what comes through. We send out stuff and we do conferences and things like that. And we have a sense of what progressive means. But my concern with the idea of progressive is that sometimes it becomes an exclusive title, right? It means, well, I'm progressive, you're not. So, you're not quite in my league or up to my standard or whatever. So there's always this bit of a problem around the word progressive, because very few people want to be seen as regressive. Some people want to be seen as conservative, okay, which is sometimes like the opposite of progressive. But it's a difficult term, and it's worth, I think, with all these things, having an opportunity to sort of ask the question, what does that mean? What does that mean to you? What does it mean to me? Intersubjectivity is an important thing to kind of open up between us. The way that's going to work this morning, if work is the right word, is that I'm going to do kind of 3 or 4 slots, right? And in each one, there'll be some time for discussion. Ideally, what I want to do at the end is have a kind of open question and response session with other people who facilitated stuff through the weekend. I know Victoria's got to go, which is a shame, but other folk will be around. And the idea there is really for things that you've been thinking about over the weekend to have a kind of forum where they can be aired and discussed, if that's something that you want to do. But in the interim, I've got 3 or 4 areas. The first one I'm going to talk about going back to the root. Why do people become radicals? What does that mean? And what's the mistake that radicals make? Then I want to talk about the idea of radical Christianity and Christians as bearers of a radical message. And in particular, I want to talk about the idea of the margins. Then I want to talk about the idea of living a radical life and what relationship that has with the idea of suffering, and specifically how the act of communion embodies the idea of engagement with suffering. If we've got time, I'll talk about sustaining a radical life as well, and how that in itself requires deep rootedness. So those are the kind of areas we're going to hopefully touch on. But let's first think about this idea of going back to the root, the whole idea of radical, and why people become radicals. So the way I see life, and we all have different perspectives on these things, but the way I see life is it's a continual process of learning and unlearning. Okay, so you're not a physicist as such, but you're kind of a physicist, right? Something similar to a physicist.
Engineer.
Yeah. Is that as good as a physicist or better?
It's better.
It's better. Okay.
I'm a physicist, so you can use a spanner.
Nice. Okay, but maybe not as good at maths. I don't know. Who can tell?
Stuff about maths.
There you go. That's the answer. So when you are a kid learning about the shape of the Earth, okay, you initially assume that the Earth is a kind of flat place because it's, as far as you can see, it kind of goes up and down a bit, but it's effectively flat. You can kind of see everywhere. And then when you're in primary school, somebody blows your mind by showing you that the world is actually like round. Okay, so you think, wow, this has changed the way I see everything. Okay, and you suddenly have become very grown up in your knowledge. The world is round. But then, of course, when you're a bit older and you go to some more advanced physics classes or whatever it might be, somebody comes along and says, well, it's not really round as such. It's more sort of rugby ball shaped, an oblate spheroid. Okay, it's kind of got a bit of a bulge to it. And you think, wow, that again, mind blown, mind change. Things are more complicated than I'd realized. But then somebody like him comes along and says, well, there's a lot more to think about in all of this. If you're traveling at the speed of light, for instance, the whole shape thing takes a whole different form. Things become squishy and it's all very different. So as you go through life, you start to learn and unlearn things. And one of the things that we do as that's happening is we become disappointed or disillusioned with things. Okay, so that happens particularly with ideas of faith and religion. Okay, people go through this, and perhaps you've been through some of that already yourself. The likelihood is that in the next few years, a number of you will become so disillusioned with Christianity or the link you have with Christianity that you may decide to walk away from it altogether. Okay, and you may even come to look back on your time as somebody who understood themselves as a person of faith or a religious person or whatever, and feel a bit embarrassed or kind of, why on earth was I like that? And that happens all the time. So even if it's not people in this room, other people that you will find that in a few years, that's their story, okay? And this is because, or partly because, people go through periods of disillusionment, disappointment. They realize that the things that had worked or how they had understood the world or understood themselves have changed. And it's basically a kind of response to crises. You may have a crisis like a health crisis. You may have a relationship breakdown. The person who you've been relying on as a kind of spiritual teacher or a mentor might let you down. Okay, happens a lot, happens all the time, in fact. And when these crises happen, people have responses to them. And one of the responses is to throw it all away. Okay, that was all a load of rubbish, chucking it away. So that's a common response. But another response is that people say, well, I need to kind of unlearn what I have been learning and relearn something new. See over there, you've got some postcards. There's a Dorothy Day postcard. There's Dietrich Bonhoeffer postcard. Both those two people were people who responded to crises. Okay, so Bonhoeffer's obvious, Second World War, yeah, and imprisonment and eventually, obviously, execution, which is pretty crisis scenario, as you might say. But his response was to go deeper into things, try and go back to the root of things, and you know, he began to explore the ideas of religionless Christianity. He sort of is the root of the contemporary new monastic movement, and so on and so on. Dorothy Day, at the same time, she was in the sort of the economic slump in America, and you know, crisis all around her. Her response was to go back to a really kind of political route. Okay, to found the Catholic Workers, and with Peter Moran, I should say. So there were lots of people like that. Jared Winstanley, for instance. Okay, he was what they call a digger, a true leveler, as they were called at the time. And he was a really, really radical person. Well worth reading up on Jared Winstanley if you haven't, if you don't know who he is. But that was partly a response to a bankruptcy. Okay, so he was a successful guy, went through a bankruptcy, had to go and work as a cowherd, and this kind of crisis in his life drove him to a sort of radical move, went back to the root of things. So my first point is that the reason that a lot of us go towards radicalism is that we are responding to a disappointment, a disillusionment, some form of crisis in our lives that drives us deeper into things. Hasn't driven us out of things altogether, it drives us deeper into things. And I think actually, in some ways, that's a healthy response to crisis, okay? I'm not saying that moving away from things is a necessarily unhealthy thing. Sometimes that's necessary. But there's a mistake that people make. There's a mistake that people make when they do this, okay? And that is that they start to, what I describe as, build a castle. They start to build a castle. And really what this is about is that people find a kind of an answer to their problem. So for instance, let's take the kind of one of the elephants in the room of the moment. Church hates gay people. Okay, so I think, well, this is a crisis in my life. I'm going to find a church that doesn't hate gay people. Okay, so you go down that route, search down into that kind of radicalism of a sort. Find a church that doesn't hate gay people. Fantastic. Okay, all is well. And then we say, okay, and this is where we're going to sit. I'll build my castle here, and this is where I'm going to be. And this is the mistake that people stop the progression. They stop the change. All right. I come from what you call a reformed tradition, and reformed is another kind of mistake very often, because people say, well, we've reformed now, that's it, this is where we stay. In fact, one of the things that we say is semper referenda, okay? Always reforming, always changing. This is the progressive thing. We mustn't stop progressing, because once we do, we start to build a castle, we start to build a kind of concrete thing. And this is my first tweetable thing. I've underlined it on my screen. Okay, I say everything slowly. We can too readily become addicted to certainties. We can too readily become addicted to certainties. And we run to them for comfort. Dramatic pause to allow the typing. But I'm sure that you've seen this. I'm sure maybe if you look inwards at yourself, you may see this in yourself. We become addicted to certainties. We run to them for comfort. And we forget that, in fact, all things are provisional. Okay, everything is constantly changing. Things are contextual and provisional. My belief is that change is the only constant. That I get that from a long tradition of philosophy, which says that everything is changing all the time. Change is the only constant. In fact, the guy who said that, well, one of the most famous people who said that was a mathematician, but it goes back way into Greek philosophy and so on. What I'd like to do now is to split you into two groups. Does two groups seem good, or do you want three? Three. Don't know where that voice came from, but that's fine. Maybe it was God. It was assertive. I don't think it was God. God's not assertive. One thing we know about God. Okay, so can we split into three groups? And what I want you to do in your groups, first of all, just have a little reflect on what I've just said. But then I'm going to ask you three questions. See if you can remember them, because I haven't written them down for you to look at. First of all, which reformers do you look up to? Which reformers, which radicals do you look up to? Where do you get your inspiration from when it comes to reformers and radicals? Secondly, on a different one, where do you see people building castles? And that might be yourself, okay? Or it might be people around you. Where do you see castles being built? The opposite to castles, by the way, I think is tents. Yeah, I think one of the things that the Bible offers us is this idea that actually we can dwell in tents. We can be nomadic people. We can always be changing, always be moving, instead of trying to fortify ourselves into positions. Castles are fortified positions, which just effectively means conflict. So where do you see people building castles? And then thirdly, why is it difficult to maintain an attitude of provisionality? Why is that a hard thing for us to do? So let's go into three groups. So there's obviously kind of one, something like that, like a middle group, two side groups. Does that sound all right? Feel free to organize yourselves as you will. We'll take a few minutes for a bit of discussion around that. Get a bit of feedback. Yeah. So the way this is going to work is that each time, so I've got these different little slots, and each time we'll do a little bit of a discussion-y thing afterwards, and then there's a little bit of time for feedback, and then we'll move on to something slightly different. So is there anything that anybody wants to feed back from their discussions? For those who've just joined us, we've just been asking some questions amongst ourselves about reformers and radicals that we look up to, and then where we see people building castles, places of certainty and security, and then the question of why it's difficult sometimes not to do that. So any responses, any thoughts?
We talked a little bit about how in some cases building castles is quite important, particularly if you've been through like trauma and things like that. It's very important to have some form of certainty and solitude and firmness that it's not for everyone to be that exploring.
We talked about how you might go back to the castle to grow your vegetables and provide you food when you went out of the tent. You can't live in a tent necessarily all the time. But it's important to know when to leave your castle and go on an expedition in your tent.
I think I heard the group over there saying something similar about places of safety and so on. Yeah, great. Any other thoughts? Any thoughts from the middle group? Anything that you guys discussed? No pressure. You don't have to share anything. Great. Okay. Yes. So there are challenges. There are definite challenges with this idea of things being provisional, not holding on to certainties. But I'm going to say again that there's a great risk in building those castles. Castles are nice, safe places. They're nice, secure places. But they're also places of conflict. They're places where we set up our castle, and it keeps us separate from other people. The risk, the vulnerability, the hard work of living in a provisional tent type place. Well, in my opinion, that's something we have to try and work at. Let's hold that in our heads, and I'm going to talk a bit about radical Christianity. So so I'm quite old in comparison to most of you, and not in my head, obviously. I said to my kids recently, at some point I'm going to have to stop dressing the way I did when I was 18. And my eldest, who's 21, said to me, "It's all right, it just makes me feel like I'm at a festival all the time." So it's kind of my vibe. I grew up in the grunge years. I was a punk rocker, and I was in a band called Alan's Imaginary Army. It was terrible, but I loved it. So part of my sort of thing was I used to wear badges. In fact, I sometimes still do wear badges, and I in fact still make badges and sell badges. And I should have brought some giveaway badges, but I neglected to do so. Anyway, I used to wear quite a lot of badges, and one of the badges I would wear, because I was like a young Christian trying to sort of work out how on earth I could kind of reconcile a kind of deeply felt Christianity, conviction that Jesus was the person I wanted to follow, with my sort of punk rock sensibilities and my political radicalism. And I wasn't an anarchist then, I am an anarchist now, but all of that sort of stuff going on. So I used to wear a little badge that said "Radical for Jesus." Right? This was in the 80s. It wasn't cool then. Definitely not cool now. But that was my little sort of thing, a Radical for Jesus badge. I look back now and I'm like, what on earth was that about? But Radical for Jesus. It's an idea. What does it even mean? What does Radical for Jesus mean? And I guess we've started talking a little bit about radicalism, but I want to talk a little bit about the radical roots of Christianity, because Jesus was somebody who went to the roots of his tradition. He was a Jewish reformer. He wasn't a Christian, as we know. He was a Jew, and he was a reformer. He was a Jewish radical, if you like, going back to the roots of his tradition. And the roots of Judaism, through that Jesus lens, were about marginal people, okay, people who lived in tents, literally, people who lived on the margins, people who were anti-empire, and a tradition. It became a tradition, ironically, onto which empires have been built. Okay, so we're now in a form of Christianity which has got an awful lot of empire sensibilities about it. Even now, even after we've deconstructed so much of that, it's still deeply empire. So here's my second quotable, tweetable thing. Woke you up? I should have a little bell. That's what I should have. Okay, Christianity comes from the margins. Christianity comes from the margins. This might be too long to tweet. I don't know. As we've already established, I'm not a very good tweeter. Christianity comes from the margins. We are people of the margins. So that, to me, means radical Christianity requires a return to the margins and to the marginalized. There's a problem, as I've already sort of set out, I think, when we become comfortable, when we seek out places where we feel secure and safe. There is obviously a reality about managing our own needs, our own health, our own spirituality, and if we've got time, we'll come on to some of the ways we can do that. But Christianity requires us to return to the margins and to the marginalized. Just look at the things that Jesus taught. Look at the response to the rich young ruler who said, you know, all these things I've done since I was a young person. And Jesus' response to that guy was, well, that's great. Now, all you have to do, sell all your stuff, follow me, okay? Very, very difficult to do. It requires a return to that sense of the margins and the marginalized. It requires not just a kind of patronizing professional relationship with the margins. It requires us to identify with the margins. Now, when we talk about the margins, there are many different margins. Okay, so there's economically marginalized people. That's only one form of marginalized identity. There are many others, and they may be to do with sexuality, they may be to do with race or class identities. There's all kinds of different things, and different people find a role in different areas, okay? But my conviction is that Christianity requires us to return to the margins. And when we don't, what happens is we become very comfortable in our safer places, and we start to build these kind of castles that keep us safe, and where we can look at other people and say, well, they're not like us, right? Which is, in many ways, I think, the antithesis of the Jesus way of doing things. I think what I'm going to do to allow us some time for this question thing at the end, I'm going to join this one with my next point, and we'll do a discussion of both. So when I talk about living a radical life, then living a radical Christian life, I walk that talk as far as I can. Okay, so for the last 15 or so years, well, I should backtrack. I've basically always lived in quite difficult places from sort of childhood onwards. But for the last 15 years, and I'm a professional person. Okay, I'm a professional writer. I have a middle class identity. But for the majority of my adult life, I have chosen to identify with a different group of people. So for the last 15 years, I've lived in a place that is considered to be quite a difficult place to live. And in some ways it is. So we had a drive-by shooting on our just up the road from us at the beginning of the week. And in fact, on Tuesday early morning, I think it was, at 3 o'clock in the morning, we could hear all this shouting outside, looked out the window, and there was armed police raiding a house across the road and walking 2 guys out. So, you know, this is a neighborhood that has some issues. But the reality is that my conviction is if Christians don't identify with these sorts of places, with the kind of people who live in those sorts of places, then what is our faith about? What are we trying to do? I completed a research project fairly recently, and I spoke to a number of people, interviewed a number of people for it, and one of them said this, and it stuck in my mind. He said, this is a guy who works with refugees, okay, another group of marginalized people. And he said that in his experience, he says the church can be so middle class. It has lost touch with the suffering of local people. Found that quite challenging myself to think about. Lost touch with the suffering of local people. I believe that unless we're living it, our faith is basically wishful thinking or possibly complete bullshit. Okay? Unless we're living it, it's at best wishful thinking, at worst complete bullshit, or just a lie. Maybe we're lying to ourselves. As young people, as people who are either beginning careers or moving through sort of early stages of your career, you'll find that the pull is towards an upward mobility, okay, and settling down, getting a nice place to live, getting a better car, getting this, getting that, those sorts of things. I believe that the Christian draw is downward, and that's the way that I've chosen to live, because that's my belief. I would encourage you to believe or to think that if we are to be radical Christians, if we are genuinely to go back to radical, we need to discover this idea of truly identifying with marginalized people, and we need to rediscover this thought of downward mobility. As soon as we start to buy into that upward mobility crap, we lose the sense of what Jesus was trying to teach us. We're going to share communion later on, I believe, and I think that the act of communion ritually symbolizes this. We remember Jesus' sacrifice, and however you understand communion, lots of people have different ways of understanding it. To me, it's an act of remembrance. But however you understand it, we remember Jesus' sacrifice. We have this central ritual, and what's it based around? It's based around embodied suffering. It's based around broken body. It's based around shed blood. Broken flesh and shed blood, that is our act of communion, of being at one together. And the challenge of the broken bread is the challenge to engage with suffering, to genuinely engage with it. It's a call for a conscious return to the margins. And some of you will be given the opportunity to do that as professionals. Okay, so that's been part of my story as well. I worked as a chaplain for a long time, community chaplain, school chaplain, etc. And that's a great thing. Okay, there's nothing wrong with doing that at all. It's a really good thing to do, and it's very helpful to a lot of people. But if that's all we are, I think that's still lacking something. It's a call to return as a fellow traveler. The word companion, okay, or good companion, bad companion, however you want to think of it. A companion, somebody who travels with you, is somebody who shares bread with you. Compan, share bread. Somebody who shares bread with you. A fellow traveler, someone who shares bread or breaks bread with people. In other words, someone who shares their life with them, who lives with them. We're called to a conscious engagement with the marginalized and with the suffering. That, I think, is at the heart of radical Christianity, going back to the root of what Jesus taught. There's a lot to unpack and to break off into our groups again. And I'll give you some things to discuss, but you may already have things that you want to discuss of your own thinking. So just break off into your groups, and then when you've done that, I'll call out some questions, and you can discuss those things or other things, and then we'll have a time sharing after that. Reconvene then. That's a good word, reconvene. I'm not sure if I use that enough. I must try and get reconvene back into my vocabulary a bit more. So, okay, so let's have a little bit of feedback then, because I talked about quite a lot of things. Hopefully, some of those things were things that you didn't immediately agree with, because part of my approach is that I want to put ideas out that will make you think or question or respond to in a strongish way. So let's start with that. Were there any ideas that I talked about that you found you didn't instinctively like, or you found yes? What's your name?
Phoebe.
Phoebe. What did you not like, Phoebe?
Sorry, I was a bit confused.
Sorry, no, it's fine. I like you already. I like you already.
When you use the term downward mobility,
Yeah.
I had a slight issue with the idea that we're here,
Mm-hmm.
and to get to the margins, it must therefore
Yeah.
be down.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Whereas I believe that we're all on a level playing field, just not, class, race, money, anything like that. We are still all level. So to move down feels rude.
Yeah. Good point. Anybody else have a problem with that idea? Yes.
I just have different difficulty with it.
Yeah.
And I think after chatting, it kind of realised that I think a lot of the story of my life has been one of awkward social mobility. So I guess the first place in my family to go to university and have a professional kind of career. So I think I struggled with kind of holding both ideas at the same time. I think politically as well, I believe in upward social mobility. I believe that there's enough resource in our country that people can, should all be able to have a relative level of comfortableness in their lives. So I find, so I guess like how you kind of work that out. So I struggle with the idea of the aspiration being downward. And that means I'm bad for kind of climbing up. So it's.
No, it's great. What's your name? Sorry. Bethany. What do you think?
For me, I totally agree with the levelling up, but I also wonder if you can have a balance of the downward and upward in terms of so you can choose which bits of downward you want and which bits of upward you want, and how you balance that out. That's
the challenge of life, isn't it? Trying to work these things out, right? Yeah. Yes. I don't know your name either. Sorry, Jennifer. Basically, by the time I've been around, I'll have forgotten everybody's names, and I'll just be like asking you the same question. Jennifer, go on.
I think a lot of this comes from the weird misunderstanding of what class is. So class really has nothing to do with your income. Class is to do with the job that you do. So working class people do like labor and working jobs, and you could be like in the heyday of British industry, like pre-Thatcher, when your miners were earning decent living or wages, like their family, but they were working class. That necessarily wasn't downwards in terms of like money or safety, but it was where we should be. So I think we need to, whereas technically I'm middle class, my mum's a primary school teacher, we don't earn that much money, but because she's in a professional job, we are technically middle class. So we do,
Sorrel, I think there's a distinction between noticing privilege and using language of people being below us.
Great. Other thoughts? Yeah. What's your name?
Ray.
Ray.
I'd like the microphone to be turned off for this if you can.
I suppose I wonder kind of what is the aim here? Is it just to live among them? Is there kind of some further eventual goal? Is that something that you approach immediately, or kind of you get to know the people by living among them, and then you kind of think about what you can do further? I mean, it would feel odd just to walk into a community that I don't understand well without knowing why I'm doing it.
Do you want to purchase? Olivia, isn't it?
Sophie.
Sophie, oh, sorry. I don't know why I thought you were Olivia. I've been thinking of you as Olivia all this time. Sophie, go on.
It would have been maybe helpful to hear from Victoria, who was here yesterday.
Mhm.
And I think she shared a story of a vicar who was put into a working class community and nearly died as a result. He had a heart attack as a result of it.
Mhm.
It's an interesting story, and that kind of links to what Patrick was saying about how do we because I agree with the principle of being among people that we can support, but how do we do that without being saviour-y and
Yeah.
how do we do that?
Yeah, absolutely. So let me start there, because that's a really important point. And the fundamental thing is this: it's not about being in a place where we can support people. Okay, that's not what it's about, because it's really about them supporting you as much as or more than you supporting them. Okay, it's a we thing. It's not a what I can do for you thing. All right. Now there's a whole load of stuff. Now I use this term downward mobility, and I do it provocatively. I do it because I believe it as well, but I know that it's a shorthand term. Okay, and I use it as a shorthand term to contrast with this sense of upward mobility, because I know that for you and for me, the societal push is to say, come on, guys, become economically active, get more wealthy, get a nicer place, all this sort of thing. This is where we should be aiming. Okay. My real view is that is the lie. Okay. It's not about I'm not doing that Jesus thing of saying sell all your possessions, give all your money to the poor, and go and live in a shed. Okay. I don't do that. I don't live in a shed. I live in a house. Okay. I have more than one set of clothes. So if I was really to buy into that idea, then, I wouldn't be living the way I am. There's a reality in all of this. Okay. There's a reality about how we live, and there's a reality about individual needs. There's a reality about individual circumstances. There is no kind of blanket thing that we can just say everybody should just be doing this. Okay. Jesus' response to that young ruler was also provocative and was also deliberately kind of blanketized, wasn't it? Okay, sell all your stuff, give all your money to the poor, and then come follow me. He didn't say that to everybody. Okay, he didn't say that to the people who would have funded his ministry and funded, the church going forward. He said it to this guy to provoke him, to make him think about what it was that he was trying to do, how he was trying to live. So there's this thing of provocative language. Now, the idea of different levels of society and of class and things like that. So class is a really difficult term, I think. I've never really understood, even though I'm a sociology graduate, and I've been doing various things, researching these sorts of areas for a long time. I still don't think that class can be well understood. I was brought up my dad was a farm labourer, okay, when I was a kid, which is a very kind of working class occupation. And we always lived on farms and council estates, and I still do. Okay, I don't live on farms anymore. I just live on council estates. But I'm a writer and so on and so on. So where does that all leave me? I'm well educated. I'm pretty sure I'm middle class, okay, but I'm not wealthy. As you say, it doesn't tally. There's all these kind of things. It's very complex. Class, I think, we almost have to leave to the side because it's such a complex idea. But the thing of going downward to a group of people, I agree with you, is highly problematic. Okay, highly problematic. I did it deliberately because I want to contrast it with this idea of upward mobility, the idea that we should all be trying to escape from a certain level of life. I think that's the lie. Okay, that is the lie, and that is the temptation that most of you will be subject to, probably for the majority of your lives. You know, there are good things about aspiration that having worked with young people for a long time, with kids, you know, I've tried to encourage them to aspire to some degree to improve the world around them, to dream big dreams, and to you know, to do things that fulfill them, and all those sorts of things. Those are good things, but when it means that we're just solidifying an unjust system, that we're building concrete onto you know, inequality, then it becomes massively problematic. So really, I think the call is as much to be disruptors of the system as anything else. Okay, and that takes into account, I believe, your own personal circumstances, the realities of life, the realities of your own needs, and so on and so on. But it means that you have to be constantly aware and constantly thinking about this, and constantly wondering, hang on a minute, am I just being sucked into this consumer bullshit? Okay, because that is the lie, and that's the challenge that we're faced with. And that's how people get marginalized when we do that. So the return to the margins takes many different forms, but it's a consciousness as much as anything else. What other things did you discuss in your groups, or did everybody just discuss that? Any other thoughts about what you discussed in your groups? Or should we move on?
We talked a little bit about like the role of clergy and how specifically in the Church of England, which is the tradition I'm from, how I perceive, it's because I'm from like quite a middle class area as well, I perceive being a vicar as quite a sort of cushy life, like middle class job. And you know, they're often vicarages, the big beautiful houses, and like I perceive it as, you know, have tea in the vicar's garden sort of thing. And it just feels so like far away from where the problem should be. And you know, like I was talking about my home church, and it's something that I've particularly noticed in the last couple of years. Like because I'm away at uni, and then when I come back and I talk to my parents who are very involved in like the church politics of my church, and just like how ridiculous the petty little arguments are that go on in my church, and how completely insignificant they are in the grand scheme of things, and so far away from where we should be as a church. Yeah, so I just talked about like how the role of a vicar, and how to me it's quite sort of like a really middle class job, when I don't know if it's always been like that or if it should be like that.
I think the reality is that there are many different expressions of in the Anglican Church priesthood, in other churches ministry of whatever form, and it takes the form of the context that people are in, and it necessarily takes the form of the sort of person they are as well. I think realistically, so you could go to East London now and find Anglican ministers working in very deprived Anglican priests, working in very deprived communities, not with that sort of lifestyle. But then you could go to somewhere else and find any church you like, living exactly that sort of life, because it's to do with context and person, realistically. But the important thing is to be aware of it and to challenge it, I think. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
I thought it might help you be able to say something.
Yeah.
I agree with you, and I think there is a particular issue with the Church of England because of our established Church of England's priest.
Right.
And so I am challenged particularly at the moment about the power that the Church of England has held as an institution in this land, and how we are diminishing in number and power. And there's great angst in the Church of England, and I'm like, yes, because I think there's a great gift in us becoming
less powerful and more marginalised. And I don't live in a particularly nice vicarage. Some of the people in I have house envy of the people in I have to absolve myself every time I get to somebody's house at the moment because they've got a lovely kitchen. But very often the vicarage is the biggest house, but it's also a workspace. That's not an excuse, but it is a workspace. And for me, I like the downward mobile thing on one side, but for me it's about living in a community, perhaps going to the edges of a community, rather than the margin stuff, and identifying with people and getting to know them. But I do think there are some significant problems in the Anglican Church about power and arguments about power, and I have the most ridiculous conversations about whether sugar could be kept. You know, that level of, for goodness sake, get
Yeah, fab. Sorry, what was your point?
I was going to say I totally agree with that as well, but I also slightly disagree with it, given that I'm a clergy child and I've seen, I've lived with my dad as a priest my entire life, and he has gone through some really stressful situations throughout his ministry. So I think, it is seen as cushy, but there are difficulties with being a priest.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's the reality of these things, isn't there? There's always some of the things that you see and some things you don't necessarily see unless you're actually in the mix of things.
Yeah, one of the difficulties, because again, I'm a clergy child.
Is anybody not a clergy child here? Oh, thank goodness for that. Okay, good.
And so I've lived in really nice vicarages my entire life, but my parents could not afford to live. I've grown up in Sussex. My parents cannot afford any house anywhere that we've grown up.
Yeah.
So my dad knows lots of vicars who are, nearing retirement age or just retired, and now have to move away from the villages and towns that they lived in and looked after for their life, because the retirement the pension that they're given, they can't afford to live in a place that they've looked after their life. And so they have to go elsewhere and then find a new community. Yeah. And it's really hard for a lot of clergy.
Absolutely. Yeah. These are some of the challenges that one doesn't necessarily see. Yeah. Thank you. Unless somebody's got a burning question, I'm going to move on to the last thing because I do want to try and get a little bit of time for some Q&R. Anybody in burning questions or burning points that they want to make or want to stand up and shout you were wrong? That's always an option. I've been getting all my life, mate. I don't. It doesn't bother me either way. Okay, so so this kind of stuff that I'm talking about, radicalism, engagement with suffering, conscious engagement with suffering, movement towards the margins, and so on, is really difficult. That's why people build castles, because castles are nice places. Well, strong, firm, safe places to live. Okay. When we live in risky places, when we live in marginal places, when we live amongst marginal people, when we become marginal people or marginalized people ourselves, it's stressful, it can be difficult, it can be very tiring, all those sorts of things. So here's another thing about radicalism and the root, because sustaining this sort of stuff requires us to sink deep roots, okay? And that doesn't mean that we are fortifying a position. That means we are bringing up nutrients for ourselves. Anybody got nettles growing in their gardens? Have you got gardens? Probably not got gardens, have you?
Lots of weeds.
Got any nettles amongst your weeds? Probably, yeah. It's easy to find out, just roll in them. Actually, don't do that if there's cats living nearby. So nettles are, I think, a really good example of this, because the nettles are a really persistent weed. Okay, they're hard to get rid of, and one of the reasons for that is they sink really deep tap roots. And a tap root is a root that goes down, a thick root that goes down a long way. And what this means is they bring up to the surface lots of those kind of minerals and things that are deep down in the soil. Which is why, incidentally, nettles are also really great plants. You can make really good soup out of them, and it tastes vile. but you can live on it, you know. So that's the thing. And also makes great fertilizer and all sorts of things. Nettles are a really good plant, so you can make all kinds of things out of nettles, in fact. But it's because they sink these deep roots into the ground. They bring up these really valuable nutrients, minerals and things. We have to learn, I think, in order to sustain these sorts of difficult, challenging lives, to sink deep roots. One of the issues I have with Jesus is that he knows. I've mentioned it before. In all seriousness, one of the issues I have with the Jesus model of ministry is that it's a short-term ministry. Okay, it's 3 years, burn brightly and burn out type ministry. It's not a 50 years in a marginal community ministry. It's not that sort of life. In order to sustain our lifelong engagement with our own shadow and with the difficulties that we face in other people, we really have to learn to do some of that deep work. We have to learn to go deep into ourselves. For some people, that requires the assistance of spiritual guides or therapists or combination of the two. Because the reality is that the battle that we face is very much within ourselves. Okay, when Jesus, there's a story in the Bible about Jesus starting his ministry, and he goes into the wilderness after having been through the water. It's an echo of the Exodus story. Goes into the wilderness and is tempted in various ways. Okay. Tempted to abuse resources and abuse relationships and abuse power. Tempted probably, although it doesn't say so, to run away from the temptation as well. But these are, so in the story, it's presented as this kind of, there's a devil character who tempts Jesus and all this sort of stuff and takes him to the top of things and all this kind of malarkey. Really what this story is about is an internal struggle. Okay, this is the internal struggle that we face as we try and engage with our own work and our own commitment to the marginalized and to the margins and to suffering and to engagement. And it's a picture of this internal struggle. We all have to go through that. And the problem comes when we try and dodge it. Okay, we try and sort of get out of these things and say, well, I'm not gonna worry about that right now. We have to go through that work, and it takes a different form for all sorts of different people. And some people say, well, what I'm going to do is go deep into like spiritual exercises or meditation or whatever it might be, and those things can be really helpful, but they're all just part of the story. The reality is that we have to keep working. It's that same thing, the progressive thing. It's the only constant is change thing. We have to keep going. There's a commitment implied and required in keeping working. There's a commitment, and that commitment means that we have to find fuel. So the last thing I want to just you guys to talk about is where you might find that fuel to keep yourselves committed. This is going to be 5 minutes, and then we're done with this session. We're just going to do some questions. So 5 minutes in your groups, where can you find that fuel to keep yourselves going? Can you shout out some ways of sustaining yourselves? Some things that you find helpful in this journey, and some things that you think other people will find helpful. Swearing. Okay. Not what I expected, but you know, also very honest. Thank you. Any other thoughts other than swearing?
Time with friends.
Yeah. So yeah, companionship, fellowship in a good old-fashioned word, friendship, really, really important. Thank you. Other thoughts?
I think just being asked. So like no one's ever asked me where I get my food from. And then I realised I've been running out of fuel. And I didn't realise that I needed to top it up until you asked. And now I don't know where to get it from. So I realised I don't know where to get it.
Yeah. And that's a really serious thing to think about, in all honesty, because you know this is a thing that happens, and then people go, "Why am I in such a meltdown?" And and that's when you think, "I've just been like running my phone battery down this whole time, and now there isn't any charge left." And so yeah, it's great. It's really important to think about, isn't it? Yeah, I find strength. Anybody else?
The Gospels and realizing kind of how radical Jesus is. That's always kind of inspiring and challenging.
Yeah. Good question answer that. Thank you very much.
I swear.
Darn it! You were putting the C back in SCM there, but now you just put the swearing back in it. Is that what S stands for? I can't remember. Swearing Christian Movement is not a bad name, actually. I'm just going to log that one. Yeah.
We kind of talked about spaces like this being a kind of place that's quite sustaining. And then we had a conversation about whether it is like going back to a castle or something like this, because we talked about it being a space that we feel safe in and that feels like home. But I also kind of made the argument that I don't think SCM can be a castle because we welcome too much diversity in our experiences.
Maybe it's the best sort of castle, one which has like open doors and drawbridges and things. And yes, you've got a position, but it's something that can change over time. Yes. Maybe I've been overextending this metaphor all morning, so why not carry on? You know. Yes.
Well, on the lines of swearing, and mine was in some like self-care, but also like allowing yourself to have emotions.
Yeah.
My example was crying in the linen cupboard at work, which isn't really a great idea, but sometimes you just need to have a moment to be like.
Find a place to cry. Yeah, linen cupboards optional.
Yeah, but actually allowing the emotion instead of going just like carrying on and being like, oh no, I'm burnt out, and actually taking the time to be like, I just.
Absolutely. Yes. Oh, sorry. Or shout. Yeah. Absolutely. Shouting, crying, swearing. They're all on a sort of continuum, aren't they?
Yeah. I'm just learning too much about how we cope now.
Shocked to the core. Shocked to the core. Yes.
I mean, regarding what Tom was saying, we were talking a bit in this group about how it's great. We come here and we're energized, and we think, oh, I'm going to do all these sorts of things, and then we go away, and we don't know anyone who's talking about this in our local area, and it's gone like a wind.
It's really hard,
It's kind of how do you continue this, and is the SCM Discord server now open to everyone? Because I feel like it would be great if there was an actual community rather than like a meme getting posted once a month.
It is open.
This feels like a sidebar. So, but yeah, it's good. That's absolutely. That's the reality of these things, which is why I wanted to sort of end my bit on that. It's not that I've got great answers for you, because I think everybody has to work this through in their own way, with their own people, and in their own groups. So the key thing is that you're conscious, aware of it, and actively working on it. I'd like to invite my fellow facilitators back up, because I feel like, and maybe I'm wrong, and maybe this will be an awkward 20 minutes or so, but shall we get some seats? I feel like maybe there are questions that people have got that maybe have been thinking about over the weekend around radicalism, around things that people have said. Victoria's not here, but we could talk about her. It's fine. She won't mind. And I feel like it's useful to have a sort of opportunity to just to sort of share back on some of these things. This microphone doesn't amplify me, does it? No. So I can just take it off.
Yes.
Okay, because I don't think this, I don't know how this is going to work otherwise.
That mic will pick you all up.
So that mic will pick us all up. Okay, cool. So, I'm hopefully not going to do too much talking. It's probably going to be you guys. So, has anybody got any thoughts or questions that have come up over the weekend that they want to air, raise, discuss? Might be another 20 minutes. Here we go.
I don't really know how to phrase this, but it's been quite interesting to see that you've all sort of taken the view of radicalism as not being necessarily forceful and not being what I would call radical in the way that I sort of expected it to be. And I think that's often something that we find in the church spaces, is that everyone says, oh, the radical thing is to do things differently, but what if the radical thing is to just keep pushing and keep doing them the same that we've always done? Because quite often the only times that things work is when they are not necessarily violent, but uncomfortable. And so I was just wondering what your thoughts on that were, when the whole weekend we've sort of been saying the radical thing to do is take a step back and look at things differently.
I don't think that's what I meant. I'm not saying it's what I said, because you were listening, and I was in my own brain. So for me, my stuff about radical morality and radical sensitivity are about stepping forward rather than stepping back, and stepping into places which are unexpected in the sense that it's not where you expect liberal Christians to want to be. And I say, you may not all identify either as Christians or as liberal, which is totally fine. Lots of people in SCM do, and I do, and I was talking. So, but that's not necessarily all of it. So my thing that actually we've kind of like ceded morality to conservatives is that actually standing in a place and saying I want to make a moral point is already like, okay, that's not, and certainly I find when I do speaking engagements with, so I did a talk at Queen's Theological College, which is a liberal Anglican and Methodist theological college, and they did not want to hear me talk. Like, it was really interesting. I said the word morality, and you just that's what it felt like. I mean, that may not be what was going on in their heads, but and nobody asked questions afterwards, because it's just like, that's not us. Like, you must be being evangelical conservative if you're talking about morality. And like, what I want to say is like, no, we have a whole lot of stuff that we're passionate about, and is about principles and is important. But because we have the concern of shame and the knowledge that sometimes in the past we've been wrong, we might need to approach it in a, rather than we'll try and land the knockout blow, we'll have a fight with one another and we'll try and land we'll just try and be better at arguing. Which, if that's your take on it, then you should do that. What I'm proposing is actually we engage in those conversations, but we try and do it differently, and we try and do it in a way which has integrity to the kind of liberal experience. But that is all very heady, and so what difference does it make to your action? We were talking, some of us were having a chat yesterday in the free time about how how we discuss the issue of abortion in this country, where it's not contested in the public media. And we're kind of like, well, but we hear some voices speaking against a woman's right to choose. And a lot of us would be very pro a woman's right to choose. So we're like, well, like, what's an effective way to make a moral stand about that against the people who are trying to argue against it, without making a thing of, like, suggesting it's a thing that ought to be debated, because, like, we quite like the status quo. So, and that's really hard. Like, there's an actual thing. We want to make sure that our lawmakers, that practitioners in the medical profession hear our Christian voice of support, but we don't want to make an argument where there isn't one and be counterproductive. That's what we were talking about, and that's really hard. And something that we talked about doing was writing directly to both medical practitioners and to MPs, just saying that we are Christians and we really support this, because they probably get letters saying the opposite, and that's not trying to have the argument with the other person that's like, and that actually what I find generally unhelpful, because nobody wins, but trying to actually make a difference. So that's the kind of like subversive, let's look at it sideways, but let's actually enter into the moral conversation and actually say what we've got here are morals. But I suppose then that comes back to that I always have to end with, I might not be right. And that does take some heat out of, because the way we're offered winning arguments is actually from people who are really sure they're right. And the way that even our parliament, they stand opposite one another, and they argue until somebody declares on Twitter that they've won. Like, did they really? Like, just because that's the way it's offered to us? And as trouble as the moment I try and make conditions around it, it starts to sound softer. So, fair, I think, is my short answer, rather than that essay.
Yeah, so my main input was on the Magnificat.
That was what I was sort of thinking of more when I thought.
Right, I don't think I hear the Magnificat as particularly gentle.
Yeah, yeah.
I think I hear it as a political call to action, a very radical call to action, and the beginning of a new thing that God was doing. And the language in that is about toppling structures, upturning things, turning stuff upside down. And I love, some of you may have seen some different images of Jesus, and a few years back I showed one of the angry Christ to my congregation around about Easter, because that's the story where he goes into the temple and creates havoc by turning over tables and letting God's men free and shouting. And that idea that we have, particularly in my tradition, of Jesus being really quite gentle and meek and mild. Mary wasn't, and God through that Magnificat wasn't, and that led into a whole new way of challenging structures. And she was doing it through, a prayer or a praise or whatever. Jesus did a good way of throwing some tables around and having some arguments. And I actually would like us to be in there being a bit louder on the things that we are passionate about, because we are passionate about some stuff, and it's okay to be loud, and actually you do get stuff thrown back at you in a quite aggressive way. So for some of us, our calling is to be standing in the breach and having missiles thrown at us. So for me, radical actually does mean action. It also means being creative. So I love the craftivism movement. I love the idea that you can do positive, fun protesting. But I'm all for a protest.
Can I make one sort of nerdy theological point, which
these guys might disagree with. Okay, so my approach to theology and politics, because I think they're both so enmeshed that you can't really extract them, is that we tend to have in our society this belief that might is right, okay, and that's exemplified in the idea that the ultimate power lies with God, okay. We talk about almighty, omnipotent, all these kind of things. The idea that God can basically do what God wants to ultimately. I think that's a complete misunderstanding. And I think the reality is that God is not able to do unto us, if you like. So my theology comes from a place of vulnerability rather than power. Which is why when I'm talking about the idea of living in tents rather than castles, and not building castles in order to try and fight out to stronghold positions, that comes from my thinking about God. Okay, I think that as soon as we start, and I'm like a lifelong community and social activist, a political activist for that matter. So I believe in activism very much. But for me, it's not about trying to wield power over people. It's about subversive, vulnerable positions, and that's why it's so hard. It's much easier to kind of solidify around some certainties and say this is right, like Naomi was saying, and and we're going to on this hill I will die kind of thing. It's much harder to take that consistent, vulnerable approach and recognise that things are provisional. We only know what we know. That might change. Well, probably will change, etc. And it comes down to how we understand God ultimately. If we think of God as being, God knows everything, can do everything, etc., then we think, well, yeah, so it's naturally it's right to be kind of like that ourselves. So we change our way of understanding God, and I appreciate this is a kind of a controversialist point of view, but if we change our way of understanding God so that we get rid of this kind of omni-deity idea, then it changes literally everything. Did we have any other questions or points that you want to raise? We've got like 5 minutes until coffee break, so we could just stop the coffee break now, I guess. If anybody's got anything burning there.
Just no pressure, but just we learned yesterday that angels die while it's quiet. No pressure. Apparently in Spain, they say when there's a silence, they say an angel died. But it's all right because in France, what was the thing in France?
They're just there.
They're just there. They're just there. And it's
combined, that normally the angel appears and then dies. So it's not an abstract angel somewhere else. We've got the angel here.
I'm so sorry. Now I've used up some of your 5 minutes. With the joke,
I'm about 5 minutes in the sunshine.
I'm so sorry.
No, I have a couple of things to remind people of before we go to coffee break. That's all to write any more questions. Just to remind that we need a couple of extra people to sign up for washing up after lunch, because we're going to do quite quickly. So if you don't need to brush off, it'd be great if you could write your name on the thing and sign up to do some washing up. And then also, this will be packed away soon, so take time in the coffee break to have a look at the merch if you're interested, and any of the flyers from the Progressive Christianity.
Yeah, sign up.
Yes, do that. So that's not going to be there for much longer. So coffee break, definitely hop over if you haven't already.
And if you want to buy something from the merch, then come to me because I've got a list.
Oh, price it. Okay, great.
No.
Can I exercise my privileges? This is my session. So I just want to say thank you ever so much for everything you shared with me, because I really value these opportunities to learn from you as much as to kind of try and provoke and engage with you. I'm really grateful for the things that you said and the way that you said them. So thank you very much.
Thank you.